Leftists, Diplomats, and the Story of Dr. Zhivago. The Nobel Prize for Literature pivoted away from the Anglo-Americans after 1954. The Academy's choices highlighted the other side of the Cold War. Between 1955 and 1961, the 7 winners included 2 leading leftist moralists from Iceland and France, 2 top diplomats connected to events that began both world wars, and 1 great Russian writer whose reputation the CIA nearly destroyed. Since 1901, 120 writers have won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Some are forgotten, many remain famous. A few became notorious for reasons that might surprise you and change your understanding of modern history. Discover them all in the 120 Nobels Challenge and let me know your favourites. This week we read the winners from 1955 to 1961. 1955, Halldór Laxness, Iceland. 1956, Juan Ramón Jiménez, Spain. 1957, Albert Camus, France. 1958, Boris Pasternak, Soviet Union or Russia. 1959, Salvatore Quasimodo, Italy. 1960, St. John, Perse, France. 1961, Ivo Andrić, Yugoslavia. 1955, Halldór Laxness, 1902 to 1998, Iceland. Halldór Laxness was the major Icelandic writer of the 20th century. He wrote 13 novels, 5 plays, and many short stories and essays. He refreshed the traditions of the Icelandic sagas. He was a citizen of a small island, forced to kneel first to Denmark and then the USA. Yet in its uncommon language, he spoke to international themes of the whole post-1945 world. He wrote in Icelandic and made innovations in the language and script. But Laxness chose the tongue of his island home only after a decade of considering more careerist choices. Danish was the power language for Icelanders in the 1920s. Iceland was then a colony of Denmark, but Laxness refused this choice in his 20s. He then explored religiosity and the old Catholic traditions of Iceland, then a Protestant country. Laxness entered a monastery after fathering a child and fleeing responsibility, and was on the path to become a Catholic theologian. But Laxness felt the spur of fame. In 1927, he travelled to America to become a Hollywood scriptwriter. He approached the first US Nobel laureate, Sinclair Lewis, and befriended Upton Sinclair. He discovered Hemingway's pared-down prose and translated Farewell to Arms. But Laxness failed. In Hollywood, his ambitions were frustrated. His values were offended. The anti-immigrant, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture of 1920s America excluded him. In 1928, he criticised American capitalism in a letter to a friend and was charged with treason by the Californian immigration authorities. He returned to write in Iceland. At home, he found a new way to embrace Icelandic traditions and leftist international values. In the 1930s, he began to write a form of socialist realism in novels and historical epics that focused on lower-class community life. Literature then rarely focused on the lives of lower-class people. Today, the reputation of socialist realism is rightly tainted by its Stalinist associations. But in the 1920s and 1930s, it was a rebellion against cloying self-preoccupations of literary aristocrats. Laxness's turn to sagas of modern lower-class people reactivated the traditions of the sagas. He reimagined them with rising socialist values. His major work from this period was Independent People, an epic or heroic tale, 1934 to 1935, translated in 1945. It melded the heroic traditions of socialist realism and Icelandic literature. It was a leftist response to the pastoral idyll of the rural north by the Nazi Nordic Nobel laureate Knut Hamsun in The Growth of the Soil. It was set in the early 20th century among rural people on the eastern moors of Iceland. This area had depopulated during the migration period of the 19th century. It was an Icelandic agricultural version of flyover country in the USA today. The novel's central character, Beato, decides to work an abandoned piece of land, which some consider to be cursed. He becomes a tyrant to his family in the pursuit of the independent life. His family turn against him. A change in livestock prices ruins him, but the idea of independence becomes the fixed idea of his life and ruin. In chapter 47, Faced with Ruin, Beato says, "My opinion has always been this," he said, "that you ought never to give up as long as you live, even though they have stolen everything from you. If nothing else, you can always call the air you breathe your own, or, at any rate, you can claim that you have it on loan." Laxness, Independent People. Despite doubt and failure, Beato marched on. He renewed his ideal of independence by walking north to a new plot of cheap, barren land. At the end of the novel, he disappears into the mist of his own ideal of independence. In May 1940, US and British forces occupied Iceland. German forces occupied Iceland's former coloniser, Denmark. The influx of soldiers into a large military base brought the boons and curses of an occupied country. The slow collapse of Germany in the war brought independence to Iceland and a political challenge for Laxness. In 1944, Iceland separated from Denmark to become an independent country. Intellectuals began to debate the meaning of national identity for a small island in an internationalised world. But it was a very brief spring for Icelandic communal autonomy. After the war, the USA converted its wartime occupation into an ongoing military base. Laxness and many others opposed it. He published a series of articles and resisted the new rhetoric of Western Cold War. In 1948, he wrote the novel The Atom Station about his country being turned into a base for atomic weapons. He fell out of favour in the Anglo-American world due to his left-wing and anti-American views. But his importance to Iceland and his fellow citizens of northern Eurasia continued. He wrote many more novels and essays and only died in the 1990s after a long, sad struggle against dementia. He wrote for the international world from his small island of great literature. The later Icelandic writer Gudmundsson summarised Laxness's approach to writing from a minor culture as, "This is possible. Nothing has to hinder you, not the language, not the smallness of the nation. And as for the subject matter, it floats in the air." His house, Gljúfrastein, is now a literary museum. You can visit 20 minutes outside Reykjavik or discover more about Laxness at the museum's website, link in the post. You can read his works in translation at this dedicated website, link in the post. 1956, Juan Ramón Jiménez, 1881 to 1958, Spain. Juan Ramón Jiménez, known 1957, Albert Camus, 1913 to 1960, France, Algeria. Camus wrote novels, philosophic and political essays, dramas and journalism. His works include The Stranger, The Plague, The Myth of Sisyphus, The Fall and The Rebel. 1958, Boris, Pasternak, 1890 to 1960, Soviet Union or Russia. Pasternak was a major Russian 20th century poet. He is best known in the West for Dr. Zhivago. Most Westerners know that book through the film. Original in 1965, remade for Western TV in 2002. Viewers who love the film may not know the international scandal of the book. Admirers of Hollywood's treatment of this epic of Russian history may not appreciate the deeper affection for Pasternak in Russian literary culture. Dr. Zhivago, 1957, won Pasternak the Nobel Prize, then became an event in the Cold War. Pasternak was the first Soviet writer to win the Nobel Prize 40 years after the revolution. But the Nobel Committee could not offer a simple honour to its political rival. It chose a banned book that inflamed the rivalry between capitalist and communist blocs. The Soviet Union, with the consent of its Union of Writers, had refused to publish Dr. Zhivago. So the Nobel Committee defied the leaders of the Soviet Union when it awarded the prize. Quite a contrast to awarding the same prize in 1953 to the serving Prime Minister of Britain, Winston Churchill. Awarding the prize to Pasternak then infuriated the Soviet government, even in its milder post-Stalinist form during the Khrushchev thaw. The Soviet Union demanded Pasternak decline the prize. It was not till 1989, under Gorbachev's reforming leadership, that the Soviet Union relented and allowed the son of its great poet to accept the award on his dead father's behalf. Unlike authors like Pearl Buck or indeed Winston Churchill, Pasternak was a great writer. Dr. Zhivago is a great novel. It is a tragic epic that spans events from the Russian Revolution of 1905 to the Second World War. Zhivago is a member of the Russian intelligentsia who gets caught between the two sides of the civil war between the whites and the reds. Millions died and the reds won. Stalin imposed terror and industrial discipline on Soviet society. More died and suffered, yet culture, individuals and the ordinary virtues survived. Pasternak celebrated their survival in his novel more than he criticised the regime. But after internal debate, the censors banned the book for departing from socialist realism and for his treatment of the still sensitive topics of the terror, the gulag, and the suffering of the people after the revolution. But a Euro-communist official from Italy obtained a copy of the manuscript when visiting Moscow. The samizdat was smuggled to Italy and published in 1957. The CIA then actively promoted the book to undermine the reputation of the Soviet Union. Books have been written about the scandal, and the CIA has declassified at least some documents related to the affair, and there's a link to those in the post. Since Gorbachev's reforms and Russia's reclamation of its non-Soviet culture, Dr. Zhivago has become a modern classic read by nearly all Russian schoolchildren. It is well worth reading. It is richer than the Western versions, tainted by Cold War and 90s propaganda. Your experience of the novel will be enhanced by reading some history of the tragedies of revolution, civil war, world war, and revolutionary politics on the peoples of the Russian world in the 20th century. But you can get the essentials in this podcast in my Russian history series, and there's a link to the podcast on Substack in the post. I encourage readers to read Pasternak's poetry to sense his importance for Russian literary culture. His first book of poems, My Sister Life, was published in Berlin in 1922 and quickly became a Russian classic. Marina Tsvetaeva, the great exiled Russian poet, read My Sister Life in exile in Berlin and praised Pasternak as a born poet in a rhapsodic essay, Downpour of Light, Poetry of Eternal Courage. There she wrote, and what a book! As if he'd deliberately let everyone else say all they had to say. Then at the very last moment, with a gesture of bewilderment, he takes a notebook from his pocket. Well, actually though I can't guarantee anything. Pasternak, let me be your guarantor to the West for a moment, till your life appears here. It's a precious thing to take part in such a destiny. Here is the first stanza of My Sister Life. In English, sister, my life, burst forth today in torrents of spring rain everywhere. But people in jewels are highly squeamish and bite politely like hidden vipers. Pasternak translated Goethe, Schiller and Shakespeare. He carried literature across the bridge between Europe and Russia. Anna Akhmatova wrote of Pasternak, and the whole world was his inheritance, and he shared it with everyone. Shakespeare was especially important to Pasternak and 20th century Russian literature. One of his most famous poems was Hamlet. It expressed his endurance through the repressions of the Stalinist era of the Soviet Union, and so was banned. In the 1930s, Pasternak had almost become one of the many victims of the Yugoslavian terror. He survived but suffered greatly, yet he was deeply loved. His funeral in 1960 was a major public event. Party officials controlled the crowd to prevent outbursts of dissent, but a mourner began to recite Pasternak's banned verse, Hamlet. The murmurs ebb onto the stage I enter. I am trying, standing at the door, to discover in the distant echoes what the coming years may hold in store. The nocturnal darkness with 1,000 binoculars is focused onto me. Take away this cup, O Abba, Father, everything is possible to thee. I am fond of this thy stubborn project, and to play my part I am content. But another drama is in progress, and this once, oh, let me be exempt. But the plan of action is determined, and the end irrevocably sealed. I am alone, all round me drowns in falsehood. Life is not a walk across a field. You can read some Pasternak poems in Russian and translation in the link in the post. 1959, Salvatore, Quasimodo, 1901 to 1968, Italy. Quasimodo was a major Italian poet of the 20th century who won the prize for his lyrical poetry, which with classical fire expresses the tragic experience of life in our own times. 1960, St. John, Perse, 1887 to 1975, France. Alexis St. Leger wrote under the pseudonym St. John Perse. He was a French poet, writer, and diplomat. Perse, to use his pseudonym, was a child of French colonialism. He grew up in Guadeloupe in the French Caribbean. 1961, Ivo Andrić, 1892 to 1975, Yugoslavia or Bosnia. Like Perse, Andrić was both writer and diplomat. He was a Yugoslav novelist, poet and short story writer. His stories reflected on life and history in his troubled nations. His diplomatic career did not reach the Munich summit like Perse, but Andrić was connected to the incident that precipitated World War I. He was a young nationalist student activist in 1914 in the same circles as the assassin of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The Austro-Hungarian authorities arrested Andrić on suspicion of involvement in the assassination that ignited the World War. He was cleared, but spent the rest of the war under house arrest. After the war, the Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved and the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was established. Andrić served the kingdom as a diplomat from 1921 to 1941, when this state ceased to be after German occupation. He lived out the war in Belgrade, effectively under house arrest again. In those conditions, he wrote his important works, including The Bridge on the Drina. Andrić called the book a chronicle. He lived in this town, Visegrad, and was the chronicler of its stories, legends, and history from the 16th century to the First World War. On the eastern edge of Bosnia, near the border of Serbia, the town's bridge crossed the river Drina, and the histories of the Bosnians and Serbs, the Muslims and Christians of the town. Over history and across the bridge, fate, chance, events and culture created a coherent, common experience of the town. Transient individual lives mingled in the enduring, constant flow of the Drina. It is a story of history itself, made by individual personalities, mass movements, shared symbols, misunderstandings, and the drumbeats of the rise and fall of empires. He established the bridge as a metaphor early on in the chronicle, and here I quote from the book: "Only when, as the fruit of this effort, the great bridge arose, men began to remember details and to embroider the creation of a real, skillfully built and lasting bridge with fabulous tales which they well knew how to weave and remember." By the end of the chronicle, the town and its bridge are besieged in World War II. Andrić describes the scene of evacuated citizens' shelters and impending bombardment as the army withdrew from the Drina. The bridge remained as if under sentence of death, but nonetheless still whole and untouched between the two warring sides. After 1945, Yugoslavia became a socialist republic haunted by the massacres of its citizens by ethnic extremists such as the Ustashi and German occupiers, including the future Secretary-General of the United Nations, Kurt Waldheim. Andrić was reintegrated into political life despite the initial wariness of the communist government of his past support for royalists. He became the president of the Union of Yugoslav Writers and a significant figure in Yugoslav politics. Andrić's work explored the complex cultural mix of life in Bosnia with Muslim, Serb and Croat traditions influenced by Western and Oriental empires, including the French, Austro-Hungarians and Ottomans. His language reflected the polyglot world he shared with Turkish, Arabic and Persian word borrowings in his South Slavic. Most scholars have interpreted the eponymous bridge as a metonym for Yugoslavia, which was itself a bridge between East and West during the Cold War. In his Nobel acceptance speech, Andrić described the country as one which, at breakneck speed and at the cost of great sacrifices and prodigious efforts, is trying in all fields, including the field of culture, to make up for those things of which it has been deprived by a singularly turbulent and hostile past. Since his death in 1975, Yugoslavia broke up and its peoples went through hell, and NATO-sponsored wars in the 1990s. Ethnic extremism returned, and some of them sought to burn the bridge that Andrić built. In Croatia, his works were blacklisted. Some Bosnian Muslims accused him of Islamophobia. But on the whole, and certainly in Serbia, the literary community preserved what was good in his writing. Perhaps his critics might read his line from the bridge on the Drina. Forgetfulness heals everything, and song is the most beautiful manner of forgetting, for in song man feels only what he loves. You can read more about this intriguing writer and cultured diplomat at his foundation. Please feel free to share this post from the Burning Archive, and I'll be back next week with more of the story of the Nobel Prize in Literature.